crown has always been portrayed as a symbol of power, glitter, and destiny. Yet, for many young princesses, that glitter was nothing more than a golden prison. Imagine being born into a palace where every choice you might make, what you would eat, what you would wear, whom you would love, was decided not by your own heart, but by the relentless demands of politics and bloodlines. For a girl of noble birth, the moment she drew her first breath, her life ceased to belong to her. She was no longer a child in the eyes of her family. She was a future alliance, a body marked by duty, a pawn to be moved in a dangerous game of power. If these hidden stories shook you, don't let them vanish again. Subscribe now and keep the truth alive. It was not uncommon for these young princesses to grow up listening to whispers in the corridors about the weight of their name, about the duty they owed to their house. They were reminded, in ways subtle and brutal, that their smile, their silence, and even their virginity were part of an inheritance more valuable than gold. The cruelest truth was that what most of us take for granted, the right to choose whom to love, was a privilege they could never imagine. Their path was already traced by the ink of kings, priests, and ministers. It is easy to romanticize the idea of palaces, silk gowns, and jewels, but behind those doors were tears, fears, and prayers that were never answered. The weight of the crown pressed not only on the heads of rulers, but on the tender shoulders of daughters. Some of them were mere children when they realized that every gesture was under scrutiny, that every friendship could be broken in a second if it conflicted with family strategy. To the outside world, they were painted as embodiments of grace and virtue, yet inside they trembled at night, wondering what kind of marriage was already being arranged for them. Sometimes the groom was not a foreign prince or a neighboring king. Sometimes it was an uncle, a cousin, or even a brother. What for us would be unthinkable was, for them, a fate sealed in velvet and stone. There are records of princesses who asked their governesses why they could not marry for love. The answers were cruel in their simplicity. Love was a luxury, and their family's survival was the only law. Behind closed doors, these girls were told that their sacrifice would preserve the kingdom, that marrying their own blood would strengthen the dynasty, that their pain was necessary. And so, the crown that sparkled above their heads was the same weight that chained their hearts. They did not belong to themselves. They belonged to history. The image of power that a crown projects is seductive, but in truth, it often concealed immense fragility. The fate of an empire could depend on the womb of a single teenage girl, and the decision of whom she would share her bed with was dictated not by affection, but by calculation. These princesses were dressed in silk, yet carried invisible shackles. Their smiles at banquets were rehearsed, their vows at the altar forced, their futures stolen long before they reached womanhood. It is here that the tragedy deepens. To the people outside the palace gates, these marriages were celebrated as symbols of stability and strength. Inside, however, they represented broken childhoods and the silencing of every personal dream. What makes these stories even more haunting is how ordinary they became within royal circles. It was not a scandal to betroth a girl to her cousin at the age of 12. It was expected. The language of duty disguised what was, in reality, a theft of innocence, and this acceptance carved scars that remained hidden for generations. A princess may have smiled from her carriage, waving to the crowd as though she had everything, but inside she carried the knowledge that she was not free. The crown, so adored by history, was at times nothing more than a polished cage. The glitter of its jewels could not erase the truth that many of those who wore it lived lives of sorrow and submission. The very symbol that the world revered was, for countless princesses, the source of their deepest suffering. And while poets sang of royal beauty and chroniclers praised dynastic strength, the voices of those girls were drowned in silence, their cries echoing only through the stone walls of their gilded prisons. And yet, this silence speaks louder the more we uncover. It forces us to see beyond the gold, to ask who paid the price for all that splendor. The answer is not in the victories of kings or the maps of empires, but in the broken hearts of those princesses who bore the true burden of the crown. The obsession with blood was not born from romance or affection, but from fear. Dynasties for centuries were haunted by the idea of losing power to outsiders. They believed that only by keeping their bloodlines pure could they protect the legitimacy of their rule. It was not about the happiness of their daughters or even the health of future generations. It was about control. In their eyes, blood was not simply a family bond. It was a fortress. To dilute it by marrying someone beyond the dynasty was to weaken the very foundation of the throne. This idea of purity became a weapon, a justification, and an excuse for choices that, to us today, feel unimaginable. The medieval courts whispered of purity as if it were sacred. Advisors would remind kings that the survival of their line depended on daughters marrying cousins or uncles. Priests, often caught in the contradiction of condemning incest while blessing royal unions, twisted words to give divine approval. The princess at the center of these arrangements had no defense. How could she argue against the language of destiny and the weight of tradition? She was told that the blood in her veins was not her own, that it belonged to the past and to the future, and that she had no right to rebel against it. The paradox of this obsession was brutal. While rulers claimed to protect the strength of their house, they were slowly poisoning it. The same blood they sought to preserve became their curse. Historians have traced countless illnesses back to this desperation for purity. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a deformity caused by generations of intermarriage, became a physical symbol of royal decay. Children born sickly or unable to survive infancy were whispered about in corridors, yet the cycle continued. To the ruling elite, sacrificing the well-being of their children was preferable to seeing another family rise to power. For the young princesses, this meant watching their lives being measured not by dreams but by bloodlines. A girl might have been intelligent, artistic, or deeply devout, but none of that mattered when the time came to decide her future. The genealogical charts dictated her worth. The ink on those parchments was more powerful than her voice, her tears, or her prayers. Many princesses were told from the moment they could walk that they were destined for a great marriage. Yet the greatness often lay in the political gain for their fathers, not in any joy for themselves. Imagine being 15 and told you would marry your cousin who was twice your age. Imagine hearing your family celebrate it as a triumph, while your own heart sank under the weight of dread. These girls were praised for their obedience and scorned for any hesitation. A refusal would not only be seen as defiance, but as betrayal, an act that could destabilize an entire kingdom. In such a world, silence became a survival skill. Some wrote in secret diaries, others confided in maids or nuns, but most carried their sorrow locked deep within them, where no one could challenge it. Behind every crown there is a silence the world must hear. Join us, subscribe, and uncover what history tried to bury. The obsession with purity also shaped the very image of what a royal woman was supposed to be. She was not seen as an individual, but as a vessel, a guardian of blood. Songs were composed about her beauty, yet her true value lay in the invisible lineage carried inside her body. Entire councils of men would sit in judgment, debating which relative she would be handed to, as though she were nothing more than a chess piece on their board. Her voice was the only one absent from the conversation. The irony is that while men claimed to guard their family's purity, they showed no purity of conscience in sacrificing their daughters. Even beyond Europe, in royal courts from Asia to the Middle East, similar patterns emerged. The narrative repeated itself across cultures. Dynasties feared outsiders, and the solution was to bind daughters to the blood they already shared. This universality reveals that the obsession was less about tradition and more about fear. The fear of losing power, of losing legacy, of seeing centuries of rule collapse with a single marriage to a stranger. But in protecting the dynasty, they often destroyed the very people meant to continue it. The consequences of this obsession stretched far beyond the princess herself. Every time a young girl was forced into marriage with a relative, it was not just her life that was reshaped, but the fate of her children and grandchildren. Generations carried the scars of these choices, whether through illness, emotional trauma, or the continuation of silence. And still, the cycle persisted. Families turned a blind eye to suffering, convinced that the preservation of blood justified every sacrifice. The language of purity promised strength, but the reality was weakness. Dynasties that clung too tightly to this obsession often found themselves crumbling, not from outside invasion, but from within. Their heirs grew frail, their courts filled with whispers of disease, and their once powerful names became shadows of decline. The very thing they feared, extinction, was hastened by the very practice they believed would save them. Yet while historians can trace this downfall, the individuals who lived it left little more than silence. Silence, and the haunting truth that purity was a prison disguised as tradition. And within that silence lies a darker reality, one that would twist the lives of these girls even further, where purity turned into a tool not just of control, but of something far more intimate and disturbing. The practice of marrying within the family was not just tolerated in royal courts. It was often celebrated as a clever political maneuver. Yet behind the polished facade of statecraft lay a truth that no poet or court chronicler would dare to write. It was incest, woven into the very fabric of dynasties. For young princesses, the word marriage did not carry dreams of love or companionship. Instead, it carried the shadow of dread, because the man waiting at the altar might be a relative she had grown up calling uncle, cousin, or even brother. From an early age, these girls were groomed to accept the unimaginable. They were taught to curtsy to the very men who would one day claim them as wives. They were told it was an honor, a duty to preserve the family line. But in the silence of their chambers, many must have felt confusion and disgust. Imagine being 12 and realizing that the cousin who once teased you in the palace gardens would soon become your husband. Imagine seeing the same people who were supposed to protect you, your father, your mother, your priests, applaud this arrangement as if it were something holy. Incest was not spoken of in the same terms we use today. It was dressed in the language of necessity, of divine approval, of God's will. When a princess married her uncle, it was said to strengthen the throne. When she was given to her brother, it was said to avoid civil war. But no one stopped to ask how the girl herself felt as she walked down an aisle towards someone who shared her blood, her childhood memories, and sometimes even her mother's womb. In that moment, she was not a bride, but a sacrifice. History is filled with chilling examples. Cleopatra of Egypt famously married both of her brothers, not out of choice, but because her dynasty demanded it. The Ptolemies saw sibling marriage as a way to mimic the gods, to present themselves as divine beings above human law. To outsiders, it may have seemed glamorous, but behind the gilded walls of Alexandria, Cleopatra was just another girl stripped of her right to choose. In Europe, the Habsburgs and Bourbons followed similar patterns. Cousins were paired off in glittering ceremonies, their faces pale not just from powdered makeup, but from the weight of knowing what they were forced to accept. The most haunting part of these unions was how they blurred the boundaries between family and power. The uncle who once told bedtime stories could suddenly be the man demanding heirs. The cousin who once shared childhood secrets could become a husband expecting obedience. The lines of trust, affection, and safety that family should provide were torn apart, replaced by a twisted logic that called betrayal duty. For the princess, family was no longer a source of comfort. It was the very source of her captivity. And while the public saw these marriages as spectacles of grandeur, the private reality was far darker. Behind closed doors, the intimacy required of these relationships was often accompanied by fear, disgust, and silence. Many princesses were too young to understand the depth of what was being asked of them. They were told to smile, to obey, to endure. To resist would mean dishonor, punishment, or worse, the loss of their family's trust entirely. They carried the shame quietly, their voices stifled by walls thicker than stone. One can only imagine the psychological toll. How does a child reconcile the knowledge that the very people she is bound to by love are also the ones stealing her innocence? How does she process the contradiction of being adored by the crowd but abused in private? The emotional scars were as deep as any political intrigue, though history rarely recorded them. Instead, chroniclers wrote of treaties secured, kingdoms united, and dynasties preserved, erasing the pain of the princess who had to live through it all. Even today, when we look back at portraits of these royal brides, painted in silk gowns and crowns, their faces tell a story if you look closely enough. Behind the calm expressions and staged elegance lies a quiet sorrow, the kind that only comes from knowing that one's body and heart have been traded away. The portraits celebrated their obedience, their role as symbols of dynastic power, but if you stare long enough, you begin to wonder what secrets those painted eyes might have held. You've walked through the shadows of the past with me. Stay with us. Hit subscribe and never miss the truths that matter. Incestuous marriages were not whispered scandals. They were official state policy. And once the wedding was over, life did not magically transform into acceptance. The girls were expected to produce heirs quickly, their youth and fear brushed aside in the rush to prove the success of the union. Some died in childbirth, others suffered miscarriages, and many endured the cruelty of being blamed if a son was not born. Their suffering was never their own. It was woven into the politics of the throne. The practice reveals something unsettling about power, that it can twist even the most sacred bonds of family into tools of domination. What should have been a sanctuary, a father's protection, a brother's companionship, an uncle's guidance, became the stage for betrayal. These princesses were forced to carry the unbearable weight of turning love into obedience and kinship into duty. And while dynasties believed they were preserving themselves, they were in truth planting the seeds of their own decay, leaving behind broken women and fragile heirs. But the tragedy did not stop there, because while the family turned inward to protect its blood, the world outside did not stop watching. And the next layer of this story reveals how these fragile arrangements often collided with the ambition of kingdoms and the silent complicity of those who should have intervened. If the first whisper of a forced marriage was unsettling, the reality that followed was often unbearable. Once the ceremonial vows were exchanged, the true escalation of horror began, because a princess was no longer a child in the eyes of her family or her court. She was a wife, and wives were expected to obey without question. For many of these girls, obedience meant enduring acts that were not just unwanted, but profoundly traumatic. The same uncles, cousins, and brothers who once held their hands in play now claimed their bodies in the name of dynastic survival. The palace, with its marble halls and golden ceilings, became a prison where the most intimate forms of violence were hidden behind tapestries and closed doors. The abuses were rarely spoken of aloud, but they left traces everywhere. Servants whispered about the screams muffled by thick walls. Physicians, summoned under the guise of medical necessity, saw bruises they were forbidden to describe in their notes. Some princesses turned pale and withdrawn, their eyes hollow long before their youth had faded. Others tried to resist, only to discover that resistance was interpreted as rebellion not just against a husband, but against the throne itself. They could not confide in their mothers, for many of those women had suffered the same fate and had learned the harsh lesson that silence was safer than defiance. Fear was not just emotional, it was physical, visceral. A girl of 13 or 14, married to a man twice her age, lived every night as though it were a punishment disguised as duty. There are recorded instances of young brides collapsing before consummation, fainting under the pressure of expectation. Yet their pain was dismissed as weakness. Advisors and priests reminded them that their wombs carried the future of the dynasty, and that nothing, not tears, not illness, not terror, was more important than producing heirs. Their bodies became battlegrounds where politics and abuse collided, leaving scars that could not be painted over by portraits or erased from memory. The cruelty extended beyond the bedroom. Many husbands, emboldened by their position as both family and ruler, inflicted psychological torment on their young brides. A princess might be mocked for her innocence, shamed for her reluctance, or threatened with abandonment if she failed to conceive quickly. Others endured the humiliation of being compared to mistresses brought openly into the court, as though the girl who had been sacrificed for politics was still not enough to satisfy the ambitions of men. Even the act of childbirth was less a moment of joy than a terrifying ordeal. If the child was sickly or deformed, blame fell squarely on the mother, as though her fear and suffering had poisoned the bloodline. What made these horrors even more unbearable was the complicity of those who might have protected them. Priests offered blessings to unions that would have been condemned in any other context. Courtiers celebrated weddings between siblings with banquets and festivals. Entire societies turned their heads away from the abuse, preferring to see only the glitter of the crown and not the tears of the girl who wore it. And so, each princess learned the same devastating truth. Her pain was invisible, and her silence was demanded as proof of loyalty. The isolation was profound. Who could a girl confide in when her abuser was also her relative, her husband, and her ruler? To speak against him was to invite scandal, punishment, or even death. Some sought solace in religion, retreating into prayer and confession, but even there they found no refuge. For the church often stood as an accomplice, granting dispensations that sanctified their suffering. Others clung to secret friendships with maids or tutors, leaving behind letters and diaries that centuries later whisper of their torment. These rare fragments remind us that behind the official histories of treaties and alliances were shattered lives hidden in plain sight. There are stories of young queens who dreaded the sound of footsteps approaching their chambers at night, who lived with the constant terror that another ordeal awaited them. Some resorted to desperate measures, sleeping pills, poisons, even attempts to flee. Yet escape was nearly impossible. A runaway princess was not just a woman fleeing abuse. She was a political scandal, a threat to the stability of the realm. For that reason, many endured in silence, convincing themselves that survival meant submission. The atmosphere of dread did not just consume the young brides, but shaped entire courts. Everyone knew, yet no one dared to name the truth. The same courtiers who raised toasts at royal weddings also lowered their voices when they spoke of the unhappiness of the bride. The same artists who painted her smile also caught the shadow in her eyes, though they would never admit it aloud. The grandeur of the crown demanded that appearances be preserved, even if the cost was the destruction of a human soul. It is in these details that the human tragedy of royal incestuous marriages becomes most vivid. They were not simply political decisions or historical curiosities. They were lived horrors, endured by children whose only crime was being born into the wrong family at the wrong time. And while history remembers the treaties signed and the dynasties preserved, it rarely pauses to acknowledge the personal cost, the cries muffled behind gilded doors, the prayers whispered into pillows, the silent endurance that kept the machine of monarchy turning. But history has a way of letting silence unravel, and as centuries passed, cracks began to appear. Outside voices began to notice what was happening inside the palaces. Teachers, nuns, and sometimes even foreign ambassadors started to question the lives of these young women. Their quiet observations opened the door to a different possibility, that someone might one day dare to break the silence that had suffocated generations of princesses. There always comes a moment when silence can no longer contain the weight of suffering. For generations, princesses endured forced marriages to uncles, cousins, or brothers, trapped in a cycle of abuse disguised as tradition. Yet history shows us that cracks eventually appeared in the stone walls of palaces. It did not happen suddenly, and it rarely happened loudly. Often it began with something small, a teacher who noticed the emptiness in a girl's eyes, a nun who recognized the trembling in her hands, a diplomat who whispered suspicions in a foreign court. These tiny acts of observation became sparks of resistance, and in those sparks lay the first fragile possibility of freedom. There are accounts of young brides who confided in tutors or confessors, their voices trembling as they dared to put their suffering into words. A few of these letters survived, hidden in archives for centuries. In them, the princesses speak not as symbols of dynasties, but as children begging to be heard. They wrote about being afraid to sleep at night, about dreading the sound of the key turning in the lock of their chambers, about the crushing despair of knowing their own family had abandoned them to such a fate. These confessions are haunting, because they reveal that behind every alliance celebrated in glittering ceremonies was a soul desperately searching for escape. Sometimes it was not words, but the body itself that betrayed the secret. Girls who fell ill without explanation, who collapsed at banquets or wasted away in their rooms, forced outsiders to take notice. In some cases, physicians dared to report what they saw, malnutrition, exhaustion, symptoms of trauma, though their warnings were often dismissed as exaggerations. Still, the whispers grew, and once whispers spread beyond palace walls, the careful illusion of dynastic strength began to fracture. Even the most powerful families could not fully control the stories that slipped into the streets. Stories of young queens who wept in private, of royal brides who begged for mercy. There were also moments of courage, rare but unforgettable. Some princesses chose to speak directly, risking everything. In Spain, there were reports of brides who resisted consummation, declaring before witnesses that they would not share a bed with a relative. In other kingdoms, a young girl might flee to a convent, seeking the protection of the church against her own blood. These acts of defiance were met with punishment, reclusion, exile, or, in some cases, death, but they planted seeds of resistance. Even when crushed, they sent a message. Obedience was not absolute, and silence could be broken. The turning point often came from unexpected allies. A governess, horrified by what she saw, might smuggle a message to another court. A foreign ambassador, disgusted by the cruelty, might carry news back to his homeland, igniting diplomatic pressure. In a world where appearances were everything, even the suggestion of scandal could threaten a dynasty's reputation. And so, slowly, the same families that had once forced their daughters into incestuous marriages began to realize that the practice carried risks, not just to their heirs, but to their image before the world. It is important to understand that freedom rarely came as a dramatic rescue. There were no gallant knights breaking down palace doors. Instead, it came through small, painstaking changes, a treaty that allowed a princess to marry outside her family, a papal decree that refused to grant dispensation for incest, a sympathetic uncle who arranged a safer match in a distant land. These moments may appear minor in the grand sweep of history, but for the girls whose lives were at stake, they meant the difference between despair and survival. The stories of escape were bittersweet. Some princesses managed to carve out lives of relative peace, married to foreign princes who, while strangers, at least were not bound by the suffocating chains of blood. Others found solace in religious orders, choosing cloisters over crowns, silence over subjugation. In these convents, away from the demands of dynastic politics, they wrote poetry, painted, and prayed. Their works, preserved in libraries, reveal voices finally free to express themselves without fear. Reading them today is like hearing echoes of long muted cries, transformed at last into words of hope. But even in the face of small victories, the scars remained. The trauma of generations of forced unions did not vanish simply because one girl managed to escape. Dynasties carried the consequences in their fragile heirs, in their reputations, and in the whispered guilt of mothers who had watched in silence. The liberation of one princess did not erase the chains of another, and the cycle continued in different forms for centuries. Yet, with every act of resistance, however small, the foundation of that cycle weakened. What makes these stories so powerful is not only the cruelty they reveal, but the resilience hidden within them. These girls, denied agency and silenced by fear, still found ways to resist, through secret words, desperate acts, or the simple courage of survival. Their endurance, though often invisible in the grand narratives of kings and empires, carried a quiet power of its own. It is this resilience that forces us to look beyond the glitter of crowns and to listen to the voices history tried to bury. And when we do, we uncover a truth more profound than any political alliance, that the legacy of these princesses is not only one of suffering, but also of defiance. They remind us that even in the darkest corridors of power, where betrayal and abuse were cloaked in tradition, there were still sparks of human strength that refused to be extinguished. And it is in those sparks that the story of forced royal marriages truly finds its haunting conclusion, not as a tale of victory for dynasties, but as a testament to the courage of the women who endured them. The veil of religion hung heavily over the lives of these young princesses. It was not simply that priests stood at their weddings, blessing what would otherwise have been condemned. It was that faith itself was twisted into a tool of submission. From the moment a girl could recite her prayers, she was taught that obedience was not only to her father and her king, but to God himself. To resist her family's will was framed as a sin. To accept a marriage to her uncle or cousin was presented as an act of divine duty. The pulpit and the palace worked hand in hand, convincing a child that her suffering was sanctified. The church's role was deeply paradoxical. On one hand, canon law forbade marriages within close kinship. On the other, popes and bishops granted dispensations to the most powerful dynasties, claiming that God made exceptions for those chosen to rule. What should have been seen as corruption was cloaked in sacred words, turning exploitation into something holy. The wedding altars of Europe bore witness to these contradictions. A trembling bride, standing beside a relative, her hands bound by vows that priests themselves had bent the rules to allow. For the watching crowd, the blessing made everything appear legitimate. For the girl at the center, it turned her prison into something inescapable. Religious imagery only deepened the wound. Priests told young brides that they were mirrors of the Virgin Mary, that their suffering was a path to glory, that endurance of pain was a form of holiness. For girls who cried in silence, this message was devastating. It meant that their tears were not to be wiped away but offered up like sacrifices. Their innocence was compared to divine purity, and their forced submission to older men was described as part of God's mysterious plan. Few things are more dangerous than when faith is used to sanctify abuse. Every voice silenced deserves to be remembered. Subscribe today and help give these forgotten women the audience they never had. But not every priest or nun remained complicit. Hidden among the archives are sermons and letters from clerics who dared to object. They wrote cautiously, knowing that to speak too loudly against royal marriages could cost them their lives. Some warned of God's anger upon rulers who defied natural law. Others whispered confessions to sympathetic ears, quietly condemning the union of siblings or the violation of children. These voices were faint and often silenced, yet they remind us that even within the church there were those who recognized the horror. Still, the dominant message was one of submission. The confessional booth, where a girl might have hoped to find refuge, often became another trap. Instead of being comforted, she was reminded that resisting her marriage was rebellion against God. Instead of forgiveness, she was given instructions to endure with humility. And so the walls of the palace closed in even tighter, reinforced not only by politics, but by the authority of heaven. In this way, religion, which should have been a sanctuary, became a chain binding her spirit. Some of the most tragic ironies came when these same girls clung to faith as their only source of comfort. In private, they prayed for deliverance, lighting candles and whispering desperate pleas. They believed, as they had been taught, that God saw their suffering. Yet the men who claimed to represent him on earth were the same ones enabling it. The contradiction was unbearable. And yet, these prayers were not meaningless. They became seeds of resilience, a hidden strength that allowed many of these women to endure what should have broken them. Their faith, though twisted by others, became their last weapon of survival. There were moments when the hypocrisy of religious sanction became too obvious to ignore. Papal dispensations, granted to marry within close bloodlines, resulted in sickly heirs, fragile dynasties, and whispers of God's punishment. When an entire line collapsed under the weight of infertility and disease, some in the church began to question whether divine approval had ever truly been present. These cracks in the facade grew over centuries, slowly eroding the power of religion to justify what was clearly destructive. In this way, the church's involvement was a double-edged sword. It gave legitimacy to practices that destroyed countless lives, yet it also carried within it the seeds of doubt that would one day help unravel the cycle. For every priest who spoke words of blessing over a child forced into marriage, there was another who quietly wondered whether they were damning their own souls by doing so. For every nun who told a girl to endure her suffering, there was another who secretly slipped her words of comfort, reminding her that God's true love did not look like this. The religious dimension of these marriages is what makes them so haunting. It was not only the body of the princess that was claimed, but her soul. She was told that her pain was holy, that her silence was sacred, that her submission was eternal. This robbed her not just of freedom in this life, but of hope in the next. And yet, it is within this very distortion of faith that the first seeds of resistance began to grow, for once doubt entered the sacred halls, it could never be fully erased. And as those doubts spread, they would collide with another force, the undeniable evidence of suffering carved into the bodies of the heirs themselves. It was not sermons, but sickly children, not theology, but deformities, that finally began to make the world question whether these marriages, however blessed, could truly be justified. The grandeur of royal weddings has always been one of history's favorite illusions. We imagine glittering halls filled with music, torches blazing against tapestries, and crowds cheering as a young princess in a jewel-studded gown takes her solemn steps toward the altar. To the outside world, it was a spectacle of unity and divine blessing, a moment when kingdoms appeared unshakable. But if you look past the silk and the ceremony, a darker truth emerges. Those same halls that echoed with applause also swallowed the muffled sobs of girls who walked toward a fate they could neither choose nor escape. Every detail of these weddings was carefully staged to conceal the reality. The gowns were designed to dazzle, the crowns to inspire awe, the public vows to assure the people that the dynasty was safe. Even the music was meant to drown out any hesitation, creating an atmosphere where no one dared to question the union. But hidden beneath the veil of pearls and gold was a terrified child, her body trembling beneath layers of embroidery. The very opulence of the ceremony served as camouflage, transforming abuse into pageantry. What should have been a celebration of love became a mask to cover the violence of compulsion. The public rarely knew what these girls endured. A princess might smile from her carriage, waving to crowds that adored her beauty, while inside she felt as though she were being led to her own funeral. The people saw a radiant bride. She saw the face of her cousin or uncle waiting for her at the altar. They heard the words of priests blessing the union. She heard only the echo of her own silence. It was a cruel contradiction. The louder the cheers outside, the deeper the despair inside. And history often chose to record the cheers, not the cries. The deception extended even further. Chroniclers were paid to describe these weddings in glowing terms, to compare the bride's grace to goddesses, to praise the groom's strength as if it were a divine gift. Artists were commissioned to paint portraits of the newlyweds, smoothing away any sign of reluctance or fear. In those images, the bride's gaze was serene, her lips faintly smiling, her posture perfect. Yet behind the canvas lay the truth of sleepless nights, of prayers whispered in desperation, of innocence sacrificed to dynastic ambition. The portraits hang in museums today, admired for their beauty. But if you look long enough, you cannot help but wonder what grief those eyes concealed. And it wasn't only the wedding day itself that carried this haunting duality. The celebrations that followed were equally deceptive. Banquets filled with roasted meats and overflowing wine goblets masked the reality of what awaited the bride when the feasting ended. Guests toasted to fertility and heirs, their laughter echoing through the halls, while the young girl was quietly escorted to her chamber, where duty awaited her in the form of a man she could never truly call a husband. The cheers of the banquet blurred into the sound of a locked door. Some witnesses, however, did see through the illusion. Foreign ambassadors, who were less invested in preserving the dynasty's image, sometimes wrote reports that revealed a glimpse of the truth. They noted brides who seemed too young, too pale, too visibly shaken. They observed the coldness between the couple or the whispers among servants about the girl's reluctance. These private documents, hidden in archives, are among the few places where the mask slips, where the horror of what was happening beneath the surface is finally acknowledged. Yet for the common people, the deception often worked perfectly. They believed that their rulers embodied strength and harmony, that their children would inherit both power and stability. They did not see the consequences until years later, when those children, frail, sickly, or mentally unstable, became evidence of the price that had been paid for appearances. By then, the illusion of the beautiful wedding was long past, and what remained was the slow unraveling of dynasties poisoned by their own secrets. It is this contrast between public splendor and private despair that makes these stories so chilling. The same event that filled streets with joy filled palaces with dread. The same ceremony that promised a future of strength ensured a future of suffering. And the very fact that people celebrated it without question shows how deeply society was complicit in preserving the illusion. For every cheer outside, there was a tear inside. For every song sung, there was a silence endured. The spectacle of royal weddings thus becomes more than a historical curiosity. It becomes a symbol of how power hides its cruelties. Behind every shimmering crown lies a hidden chain. Behind every golden procession lies a girl forced to walk toward her own captivity. And while the world saw only the pageantry, the true story lived on in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered centuries later. And when those shadows finally began to emerge, when the reality of these unions became too heavy to disguise, the illusion began to crumble. The consequences could no longer be hidden behind music and silk, because the very bodies of the heirs themselves carried the evidence of what had been done in the name of purity and power. The obsession with keeping bloodlines pure did not remain confined to the wedding halls or the chambers of young brides. It seeped into the very fabric of dynasties, reshaping their future in ways no amount of pageantry could disguise. The truth revealed itself most cruelly in the heirs born of these incestuous unions. Children who were supposed to embody the strength and continuity of kingdoms often carried the visible scars of choices made in the name of purity, frailty, deformity, infertility. These became the quiet legacy of generations of girls forced into marriages they never wanted. The most infamous case in European history is perhaps the Habsburg dynasty. For centuries, they insisted on marrying within their own family, binding cousins to cousins in the belief that only shared blood could safeguard their empire. But the result was a haunting portrait of decline. Charles II of Spain, often called the Bewitched, was the tragic symbol of this obsession. Born with a grotesquely protruding jaw that made it difficult for him to chew or speak, he also suffered from numerous illnesses, seizures, and infertility. His body was a living testament to the cost of incestuous politics. His court tried desperately to project strength, but behind the walls of the palace, everyone knew the truth. The empire's most powerful dynasty had weakened itself from within. Yet Charles II was not an isolated case. Across Europe, similar patterns emerged. Children were born with developmental disorders, illnesses that could not be explained, and lives that ended before they reached adulthood. Some could not walk, others could not speak, and many never lived long enough to produce heirs. The very thing dynasties had tried to preserve, their continuity, was slipping away because of the marriages they forced upon their daughters. Doctors of the time, unable to fully understand genetics, often attributed these tragedies to curses or divine punishment, but the real cause was far more human: greed, fear, and the relentless desire to keep power in the family. Even when physical deformities were not obvious, the toll was felt. Many heirs were described as weak, timid, or unstable, unfit to govern empires that demanded strength. Some historians have speculated that the instability of certain monarchs, erratic decisions, paranoia, cruelty, was not only the product of politics, but also of centuries of genetic isolation. These flaws rippled through kingdoms, sparking wars of succession, civil unrest, and, in some cases, the total collapse of dynasties. In this way, the suffering of princesses forced to marry their kin did not end with them. It spread into the very core of the political world. The cruelty of this cycle was that the princesses themselves were often blamed for these outcomes. If a child was sickly or deformed, whispers in the court accused the mother of weakness, sin, or failure. Rarely did anyone blame the system that forced her into a marriage with a relative. The burden of guilt was added to the burden of abuse, silencing these women even further. They carried not only the scars of their own suffering, but the shame of dynasties collapsing under choices they never made. The tragedies also had cultural echoes. Poets, writers, and even satirists began to notice the contrast between the grandeur of royal weddings and the frailty of royal children. Rumors spread among common people who began to see the sickness of heirs as proof that rulers had angered God. In taverns and marketplaces, whispers of divine punishment grew louder, feeding unrest and diminishing the aura of invincibility that monarchs had carefully built. What was once seen as a symbol of stability became a reminder of corruption and decay. The irony is that the very obsession with bloodlines that drove these marriages ultimately led to their undoing. Dynasties weakened by inbreeding could not sustain themselves against rivals who allowed fresh alliances. Powerful empires crumbled, not under the weight of foreign armies, but under the fragility of their own heirs. This was the cruel twist of history. The same strategy meant to preserve power hastened its destruction. The gilded palaces, the golden crowns, the carefully orchestrated weddings, all of it ended with dynasties fading into shadows, remembered not for their glory but for their decline. Yet within this decline lies the haunting question of legacy. The stories of frail heirs and collapsing empires overshadow the forgotten voices of the princesses themselves. They had been told that their marriages would secure the future, that their suffering was necessary, that their wombs were the lifeblood of the dynasty, but instead of salvation, they delivered generations marked by illness and despair. The weight of responsibility placed upon them was unbearable and the blame unjust. Still, the cycle repeated, until it could no longer sustain itself. What remains most chilling is how long this cycle persisted, even as the evidence of its consequences became undeniable. Families watched their heirs die young, yet they continued to force daughters into marriages with cousins and uncles. They saw their empires weaken, yet still they clung to the illusion of purity. It shows how deeply fear and ambition can blind those in power, how the suffering of children and the cries of brides can be ignored when crowns are at stake. And it also sets the stage for the inevitable shift that would come, because eventually the fractures became too large to hide. Outsiders noticed, scholars questioned, mothers whispered warnings, and in the cracks of this decaying system, the possibility of rebellion began to emerge. Not just rebellion of empires, but of the very women who had been silenced for generations. It was in their defiance, subtle at first but growing stronger, that the cycle of horror began to break. Love, in the world of princesses, was not just a forbidden fruit, it was treated as treason. In a society where dynasties demanded obedience above all else, the simple act of falling for someone outside the royal bloodline could be enough to destroy a girl's future. The irony is striking. In fairy tales, love is always the reward, the dream that crowns the princess's journey. But in real life, for many of these young women, love was a crime that could never be confessed aloud. Every glance, every letter, every secret conversation carried the weight of danger because it threatened to unravel the delicate web of power built around her. There are accounts of princesses who dared to love beyond their bloodline and paid the price. Some were discovered exchanging letters with soldiers, musicians, or tutors, men who could never have been considered suitable. Those letters, once uncovered, were read aloud in courts as evidence of betrayal. The girls were often punished harshly, locked in convents, exiled to remote castles, or stripped of their titles. In the eyes of their families, their sin was not the love itself, but the audacity of seeking choice where no choice was allowed. Their bodies had been sold to political strategy, and any attempt to reclaim them was treated as rebellion. One of the most tragic aspects of this reality is how carefully princesses had to hide their affections. A smile held too long at a banquet, a moment of laughter with a guard. Even the choice of a song played on a lute could be enough to arouse suspicion. The palaces were filled with eyes and ears, servants eager for favor, courtiers waiting for a chance to gossip, priests who listened in confession but reported to kings. There was no place safe enough to nurture love. For a princess, even her own heart was not her own. History remembers some of these women with bitterness, as though they were foolish for falling in love at all. Yet when we step closer, their defiance becomes something far more powerful. To choose love in a world designed to deny it was an act of extraordinary courage. Think of the Spanish Princess Juana of Castile, remembered by history as Juana la Loca. Though her story is complex, much of her suffering stemmed from her uncontrollable love for her husband Philip. Her passion was used against her, painted as madness, a cautionary tale that love could only lead to ruin for royal women. The lesson was clear: love was dangerous, and those who embraced it risked losing not only their status, but their sanity in the eyes of the world. In some cases, the punishments extended beyond the women themselves. Families feared that children born from forbidden loves might challenge dynastic legitimacy. There are whispers of infants taken away, hidden, or even killed, because their very existence threatened the political order. These tragedies remind us that the crime of love was not just punished in the lives of women, but in the silencing of entire bloodlines that might have been. To protect power, the most innocent were erased. The cruelty of this system becomes even clearer when we consider the hypocrisy of the men who enforced it. Kings, princes, and male relatives freely pursued affairs, filling palaces with illegitimate children. Their actions were excused as passion or politics, their sons sometimes even rewarded with titles. But when a princess dared to love on her own terms, her actions were treated as a catastrophe. The double standard was glaring. Men's desires were indulged, women's desires were crimes. The crown demanded that a princess's heart be as tightly bound as her body, chained to decisions she never made. Yet, despite the risks, love continued to bloom in the shadows. We know this because hidden letters, secret poems, and anonymous songs survive in fragments, speaking of passion too strong to be silenced. Some princesses used coded language to disguise their feelings, writing of friendship or devotion when they meant love. Others carved initials into books or embroidered small symbols into clothing, desperate for some way to leave a trace of what they truly felt. These tiny rebellions, though often unnoticed at the time, reveal that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit clung to love. What makes these stories so compelling is not only the suffering, but the defiance. To love at all was to resist the machinery of dynasties. To feel desire was to claim humanity in a system that sought to strip it away. And though many of these women were punished, their stories echo across centuries as proof that power could not fully extinguish the most basic of human instincts. They remind us that beneath the crowns and the jewels, these were still young girls, longing for connection, warmth, and freedom. But the forbidden nature of love also left behind dangerous legacies. Rumors of secret affairs and illegitimate children sometimes erupted into full-blown political crises, with wars of succession fought over whispers of who was the true heir. Dynasties that had sacrificed daughters for control found themselves undone by the very thing they feared most: love breaking through the walls of their carefully guarded bloodline. And this is where the story deepens. Because while love was punished, it was not the only source of danger for these young women. Even obedience could not guarantee safety. A princess could devote herself fully to her role and still find herself at the mercy of cruelty, betrayal, and punishment. The very act of surviving within the system often demanded sacrifices that left scars more profound than exile or imprisonment. And as we look closer, we begin to see that rebellion took many forms. Not just love, but silence, endurance, and, at times, open defiance. The consequences of forcing princesses into marriages with their own relatives did not end with broken hearts or stolen innocence. The deeper price was paid in the bodies of their children. Dynasties that boasted of purity soon discovered that purity could be poison. What they had celebrated as divine bloodlines turned into fragile legacies, marked by illness, deformity, and decline. The obsession with keeping power within the family created a cycle where each generation became weaker than the one before, and the toll on these women was devastating. Childbirth, already perilous in the medieval and early modern worlds, became even more dangerous when the parents were closely related. Princesses married to cousins or uncles faced the unbearable pressure of producing healthy heirs, even as the odds were stacked against them. Miscarriages were common, stillbirths even more so, and many mothers suffered repeated losses that crushed their spirit. In some courts, it was whispered that a woman's womb was cursed if she could not produce a strong son, though the real curse was the genetic entrapment imposed upon her. To make matters worse, these tragedies were rarely acknowledged as the fault of the system. Instead, blame was heaped on the princess herself, as though her tears and broken body were signs of personal failure. The history of the Habsburgs provides one of the clearest examples. For centuries, the family arranged marriages between close relatives to maintain control of vast territories stretching across Europe. But the children of these unions bore the cost. Charles II of Spain, perhaps the most infamous product of inbreeding, was described as physically deformed, mentally unstable, and incapable of ruling effectively. His jaw jutted so severely that he could barely eat, his tongue was so large that he could hardly speak, and he suffered from seizures and infertility. His body became a living symbol of a dynasty collapsing under the weight of its own choices. Yet while he is remembered as the bewitched, the women who bore him and others like him are remembered far less, their suffering erased behind his grotesque legacy. But the problem was not limited to the Habsburgs. The Bourbon dynasty of France, the royal houses of Portugal, and even the ancient rulers of Egypt all carried the scars of incestuous unions. Cleopatra herself was the product of generations of sibling marriages, as the Ptolemies imitated the gods by marrying brother to sister. Though she became legendary, Many of her relatives did not survive childhood or adulthood unscathed. Fragile bodies, unstable minds, and short lifespans haunted these bloodlines, even as their rulers draped themselves in gold and declared themselves divine. For the princesses forced into these marriages, the pressure was unbearable. They were expected to endure multiple pregnancies despite the risks, their health sacrificed again and again for the hope of one healthy heir. Many died young, their bodies worn out by childbirth, their names barely remembered while their husbands continued to rule. Others lived long enough to see their children grow sick or die, forced to grieve in silence while courtiers whispered about their supposed inadequacy. Some turned to religion for comfort, retreating into prayer and ritual, while others sank into despair, described by chroniclers as melancholy or mad. These labels were cruel simplifications of what they had endured. The cruelty of this cycle lay in its blindness. Even as evidence piled up that inbreeding produced sickly heirs, dynasties continued the practice. Fear of losing power outweighed the suffering of mothers and children alike. The crown's survival was measured not in lives saved, but in names preserved, and no amount of death or disease could shake that obsession. It was not until dynasties faced the brink of extinction, when no healthy heirs remained, that the reality could no longer be denied. By then, generations had already been lost to the silence of the palace, and yet the bodies of those heirs told a story no court could fully hide. Portraits of young princes with sunken eyes, chronicles of kings who could not speak clearly, reports of sudden deaths before the age of 20, all became pieces of evidence against the system that had created them. The irony is bitter. Dynasties that silenced their daughters to preserve themselves were undone by the very children those daughters bore. The same wombs they treated as tools of survival became instruments of decline, delivering heirs too frail to hold the weight of a crown. The story becomes even more haunting when we realize that these women were often aware of the danger, even if they could not name it scientifically. They saw their children suffer, they buried them too young, and they endured the whispers that followed. Yet they were powerless to change the pattern. Some must have wondered whether their compliance had doomed the very families they were told they were saving. In this sense, the greatest tragedy of all was not just the suffering inflicted on them, but the knowledge that their pain did not even achieve the purpose for which it was demanded. And so the legacy of incestuous royal marriages is written not only in the chronicles of kings, but in the unmarked graves of countless children, in the hollow eyes of portraits, and in the silence of women whose lives were reduced to wombs for dynasties already doomed. But the story does not end with sickness and sorrow, because in the midst of this devastation, cracks began to form in the system. Advisors, foreign rulers, and even some members of the church started to question the wisdom of repeating mistakes that brought only ruin. And it is in those first whispers of doubt that the seeds of resistance would begin to grow, preparing the ground for a slow but undeniable transformation. The life of a princess was often described in gilded terms: silks draped across her shoulders, jewels glittering in her hair, and carriages waiting to carry her through cheering crowds. But beneath all the trappings of luxury, she was little more than a coin passed from one hand to another. In the eyes of kings and councils, she was not a daughter or a sister, but a bargaining chip, a piece of living currency to seal alliances, secure treaties, or strengthen dynasties. The tragic irony is that these women born into unimaginable privilege had less control over their destinies than the poorest peasant girl who could choose her own husband in a village square. When we say that a princess was married off, what we truly mean is that she was traded. Marriages between relatives were not presented as love stories, but as contracts signed in flesh and blood. The throne was a marketplace, and the daughters of kings were its most valuable commodities. Their bodies became parchment upon which treaties were written. Their wombs became the ink that sealed borders. And all of this was done without asking them, without even pretending that they had a choice. The cruelty was wrapped in ceremony, so that the transaction looked like celebration, but the truth was much colder. These women were sold to preserve power. Consider how calculated these decisions could be. A girl might grow up believing she would marry into a neighboring court, only to discover that her destiny had been redrawn at the last moment to favor a cousin at home. Sometimes contracts were signed when she was barely out of the cradle. The betrothal of infants was not uncommon, with the child's name written next to that of her intended groom on documents she could not yet read. From that moment on, her entire life was chained to a decision made in candlelit councils, her future exchanged like gold across a table, and the trades were rarely clean. A princess promised to one suitor could be redirected at the last minute to another if politics demanded it. Letters between courts are filled with these negotiations, describing women in the same terms one might use for property: valuable, useful, necessary. Their personalities, their hopes, their fears never entered the discussion. They were pawns in a game of power that never paused to wonder if the pieces themselves were bleeding. This transactional view also explains why the abuse of incestuous unions was tolerated for so long. To powerful men, it made perfect sense to keep the coin within the family, to prevent outsiders from claiming their prize. It was not seen as cruelty, but as efficiency. By marrying daughters to cousins or uncles, they believed they were protecting their treasure from leaving the vault. But in doing so, they reduced their daughters to objects whose worth was defined only by proximity to a crown. It is one thing to be given away to a stranger in a foreign land. It is another to be handed to a relative you cannot escape. The emotional cost of this commodification was immense. Princesses were forced to smile through ceremonies that sealed their captivity. They bowed to men they might have despised, kissed the hands of husbands they feared, and bore children under the watchful eyes of families who cared only about heirs, not happiness. Some accepted their fate with a silence that history mistook for compliance. Others left behind fragments of letters and diaries, revealing the heartbreak of being treated as objects rather than people. These writings are rare, but they are powerful reminders that behind every treaty was a girl whose tears did not make it into the official record. The hypocrisy of this system becomes even clearer when compared to the freedoms of common women. A peasant girl, no matter how poor, could choose to refuse a suitor. She could marry for love or not at all. But a princess, surrounded by wealth and splendor, had no such luxury. Her cage was gilded, but it was still a cage. The greater her beauty, the sharper her chains. The more valuable her lineage, the heavier her burden. For every diamond placed upon her head, there was another chain fastened around her soul. This commodification also meant that a princess's worth could vanish overnight. If she failed to produce heirs, or if political winds shifted, she could be discarded like a coin no longer in circulation. Some were sent to convents, others exiled to remote estates, their names forgotten as quickly as they had once been celebrated. Their value was never intrinsic. It depended entirely on their usefulness. And once that usefulness was gone, so too was their place in the story of power. Yet even as pawns, some princesses learned to play the game. History remembers a few who managed to turn their position into leverage, negotiating for better matches, using charm or wit to influence the men around them. But these were exceptions, rare sparks of agency in a system designed to extinguish it. For most, the role of currency left no room for resistance. They were born with crowns they could never remove, shackled by names that others celebrated but they could never escape. The image of a princess as a symbol of beauty and hope is a myth carefully cultivated to distract from this truth. Behind the fairy tale lies the contract, and behind the contract lies the human cost. Every time a dynasty celebrated the marriage of a daughter, it was celebrating not her joy but her sacrifice. And when we strip away the layers of ceremony and gold, what remains is a haunting realization. These women were commodities disguised as queens, coins wrapped in silk, pawns who were never supposed to become players. But history, as it often does, began to shift. The same transactions that kept power in place also planted the seeds of rebellion. Some princesses, tired of being traded, sought ways to break the pattern, sometimes through subtle acts of defiance, sometimes through open confrontation. And it is in those acts of resistance, small, fragile, yet powerful, that we begin to see the outlines of a different story, one where the pawn dares to challenge the game itself. The voices of these princesses were not meant to be heard. Their lives were orchestrated, their movements choreographed, their words carefully managed so that the image of obedience would never fracture. Yet behind the marble walls and the heavy curtains, some of them left traces, letters, diaries, confessions, fragments of poetry, that reveal the depth of their sorrow and the courage of their hidden resistance. These voices, faint and fragile, survived centuries of silence. They remind us that even when entire kingdoms conspired to erase them, the truth found ways to slip through the cracks. Some of these writings were hidden deliberately. Servants smuggled letters to sympathetic relatives, or nuns preserved the confessions of women who sought refuge in convents. In one letter attributed to a young Habsburg princess, she described her terror of sharing a bed with a man she had once called uncle, confessing that she prayed each night for death to come quickly. Another fragment, written in a convent, spoke of the relief of silence after years of ceremonies that had forced her to smile. These were not grand political manifestos. They were the quiet voices of human beings who longed simply to be free of their golden cages. Historians often stumble across these records in unexpected places, tucked inside prayer books, scrawled in margins, or sealed in archives that dynasties hoped would never be opened. Each discovery feels like a breath from the past, a reminder that the women history tried to erase refused to vanish entirely. Their words are raw and unpolished, but precisely because of that, they carry a piercing authenticity. Unlike the official chronicles, which praised dynasties for their strategic marriages, these testimonies expose the cost paid in tears and broken hearts. And then there were the whispers, preserved not in ink, but in oral tradition. Servants told stories to their children of what they had seen. Brides too young to walk to the altar without trembling. Queens who wept in silence as they embroidered by candlelight. Mothers who buried infant after infant, yet were still expected to smile at court banquets. These stories passed through generations like ghostly echoes, until finally, historians collected them centuries later. The official record may have ignored these women, but the memory of their suffering was never fully lost. The very existence of these testimonies unsettled the carefully constructed myths of monarchy. Kings and priests declared that incestuous marriages were noble sacrifices for the survival of dynasties, yet the words of the women themselves told a different story, one of fear, coercion, and betrayal. Once these voices began to surface, the cracks in the narrative could not be repaired. The image of the radiant princess who joyfully married her cousin began to look less like a fairy tale and more like a nightmare dressed in silk. It is telling that many of these writings were discovered only in modern times, long after the dynasties they described had crumbled. The silence of centuries was deliberate. Powerful families had every reason to suppress such testimonies, for they revealed not the strength of monarchies, but their rot from within. Yet the truth has a way of enduring, even if it must lie hidden for hundreds of years, and when it emerges, it forces us to confront the humanity of those who lived through horrors we can barely imagine. What is most haunting about these testimonies is their dual nature. On one hand, they speak of despair so deep that it seems unbearable. On the other, they reveal extraordinary resilience. Even in the darkest circumstances, these women found ways to endure, to write, to hope. A diary entry might describe a night of terror, followed by a prayer for courage. A letter might express sorrow at being betrayed by family, yet also gratitude for a moment of kindness from a maid or a friend. These glimpses remind us that their lives were not defined solely by suffering, but also by the small acts of survival that allowed them to hold onto fragments of their identity. Some testimonies even hinted at subtle defiance. A princess who embroidered secret symbols into her garments, visible only to those who knew where to look. Another who used coded language in her letters, expressing love or despair in metaphors that slipped past the watchful eyes of censors. These small rebellions may seem insignificant, but they mattered. They were ways of saying, I exist, I feel, I will not be erased. In a world that demanded silence, even the quietest whisper of defiance was an act of power. And perhaps that is why these testimonies strike us so deeply today. They transform history from an abstract story of dynasties and empires into something intimate and painfully human. They allow us to hear the voices of girls who were once treated as currency, as pawns, as wombs for heirs, but who insisted on being remembered as people. Their words echo across the centuries, breaking the silence that once smothered them, forcing us to confront the hidden cost of crowns and the cruelty disguised as tradition. Yet as powerful as these voices are, they also leave us with a haunting question. What of the women whose words never survived? For every diary uncovered, how many were burned? For every letter preserved, how many were torn apart? For every whisper remembered, how many were silenced forever? The absence itself becomes a testimony, reminding us that silence is not the absence of suffering, but the mark of how thoroughly it was erased. And so, in the end, the voices that remain are not just fragments of the past, they are warnings. They tell us that power built on silence will always crumble, that the human heart cannot be bound forever, that even the quietest whispers can outlast crowns. And from those whispers rises the next chapter of this story, the moments when silence gave way to rebellion, when women no longer accepted their fate, and when the world itself began to shift in response to their courage. The great irony of these forced marriages is how they were transformed into spectacles for the public. To the people gathered in town squares or lining the streets, the weddings of princesses seemed like moments of triumph. They saw the gleam of golden carriages, the procession of soldiers in armor, the church bells ringing for hours as if heaven itself were blessing the union. What they did not see was the trembling of the bride's hands, or the silent dread that filled her chest as she was paraded like a symbol of stability she did not feel. The pageantry was designed to dazzle, to distract, to convince entire nations that their rulers were chosen by God and strengthened by unbreakable family ties. But beneath the glitter, the reality was something far darker. Royal weddings were carefully staged theater. Every detail, from the embroidery on the bride's gown to the words spoken by the priest, was crafted to present an image of unity and prosperity. Chroniclers recorded these details in glowing language, often exaggerating the beauty of the bride and the majesty of the groom. Their writings would later become official history, passed down as if they were faithful accounts of joyous events. Yet those who looked more closely could sometimes see the cracks. There are reports of brides weeping behind their veils, of fainting at the altar, of needing to be physically supported by attendants during the ceremony. These incidents were either erased from records or reinterpreted as signs of modesty and piety. The truth was buried beneath the weight of appearances. The spectacle was not for the princess herself, it was for the people. In eras of unrest, famine, or political uncertainty, the display of a royal marriage reassured subjects that the dynasty remained strong. A marriage between relatives was spun as proof of stability, an unbreakable circle of power that could not be invaded by outsiders. The public, desperate for symbols of order, often embraced the illusion. They cheered the smiling couple, not knowing, or perhaps not daring to acknowledge, that behind the curtains of the palace the smile disappeared and tears replaced it. Some ceremonies reached almost surreal levels of grandeur. In the Habsburg courts of the 17th century, wedding banquets lasted for days, with fountains of wine flowing in the streets and entire cities illuminated by torches. Musicians composed special pieces for the occasion, poets wrote verses to celebrate the bride's beauty, and fireworks lit up the sky. To the people watching, it was a once-in-a-lifetime spectacle. To the bride, it was a moment of erasure, the point at which her identity as an individual was dissolved into her role as wife, vessel, and symbol. The louder the celebration outside, the deeper the silence inside. Artists also played a key role in preserving the illusion. Portraits of royal couples were commissioned almost immediately, painted with layers of oil that glossed over fear and replaced it with serenity. In these paintings, the princess looks serene, her skin flawless, her expression calm. But many of these portraits share a strange emptiness in the eyes of the women. Whether intentional or not, the stillness of the painted faces seems to betray something unspoken, a quiet resistance or grief that even the brush could not fully erase. The public adored these images, hanging them in palaces and courts as proof of dynastic harmony, while the truth remained hidden in whispers and shadows. Even the rituals themselves carried layers of deception. The moment when a bride's hand was placed into her groom's was presented as a sacred exchange, but for the princess, it was the moment she was passed from one owner to another. The kiss at the altar, celebrated as the seal of union, was often the first touch of intimacy forced upon her. And the procession into the marital chamber, a ritual in many courts, turned what should have been a private act into a public display, overseen by attendants and priests to ensure that duty had been fulfilled. What was presented as celebration was, in truth, ritualized humiliation. Yet the pageantry also carried within it the seeds of doubt. Outsiders, ambassadors, foreign nobles, even servants, sometimes noticed the cracks in the performance. Reports survive of diplomats writing back to their courts about brides who looked ill, about grooms who seemed indifferent, about unions that appeared more like political theater than sacred vows. These private accounts, preserved in dusty archives, reveal that not everyone was fooled by the show. The illusion worked best on the masses, who saw only what they were meant to see, but even within the courts, some recognized that the splendor concealed rot. The contradiction between public spectacle and private suffering is perhaps the most haunting legacy of these weddings. For the people, they were moments of joy, proof of continuity, reasons to celebrate. For the princesses, they were often the darkest days of their lives, the beginning of a lifetime of subjugation. This duality ensured that their pain was invisible, drowned out by the noise of cheers and fireworks. And yet, in time, the truth would find ways to seep through. The frailty of heirs, the whispers of servants, the despair preserved in letters, all revealed that the glitter of the crown was nothing more than a mask. What these spectacles reveal most clearly is the power of illusion. Monarchies survived as much on appearances as on armies, and the forced marriages of princesses were perhaps their most effective illusion of all. They turned cruelty into celebration, submission into virtue, and silence into harmony. But illusions cannot last forever. The very heirs born of these unions carried in their bodies the undeniable proof of what had been done, and their weakness shattered the myth of dynastic strength. And when the illusion finally began to break, it did not only expose the suffering of women, it exposed the fragility of the entire system, showing that no amount of ceremony or spectacle could preserve a dynasty built on betrayal. From this realization emerged a new kind of story, one not about pageantry, but about rebellion, the rare and remarkable moments when princesses themselves dared to resist the roles forced upon them. Defiance was never easy for a princess. To resist a marriage, chosen by her father, her uncle, or even the church itself, meant standing against forces that could crush entire nations. Yet history holds rare but unforgettable stories of women who dared to push back. Their rebellions, sometimes quiet and sometimes dramatic, illuminate the cracks in a system that demanded obedience above all else. And though many of them paid a heavy price, their defiance planted seeds of change that would outlast the very dynasties that tried to silence them. Some acts of resistance were subtle. A princess might delay her marriage by feigning illness, taking to her bed with symptoms that no doctor could quite explain. Others pretended to be devoutly religious, stretching out the rituals of prayer and retreat in hopes of buying time. These delays rarely altered their fate completely, but they revealed a crucial truth. Even in the most suffocating systems, women searched for small ways to carve out moments of control. Their rebellions were not grand escapes, but tiny fractures, reminders that submission was never absolute. There were also bolder stories. In medieval Spain, there are records of young brides who, on their wedding nights, resisted consummation, locking themselves in their chambers and declaring before witnesses that they would not submit to men who were their own kin. Some were dragged to their beds by force, others imprisoned until they relented, but their defiance left behind echoes that history could not erase. In other courts, princesses attempted escape, fleeing to convents where the protection of nuns and the sanctity of holy walls offered at least temporary safety. To choose the veil of a nun over the crown of a queen was shocking in its own right, yet for some, it was the only path to freedom. One of the most poignant examples comes from the Renaissance courts of Italy, where convents often became sanctuaries for women who refused to be pawns in their family's dynastic games. Behind the cloistered walls, these women wrote poetry, studied theology, and expressed a kind of intellectual and spiritual freedom they could never have known at court. Their families sometimes raged at their choices, cutting them off or spreading rumors of madness, but the convent became a space where rebellion could survive, disguised as piety. Not all defiance took the form of open refusal. Some princesses fought their battles through words. Letters smuggled across borders reveal women who appealed directly to foreign monarchs, popes, or even sympathetic cousins, begging for intervention. These letters were acts of desperation, but also of extraordinary courage. To put one's fears into writing, knowing the letter might be intercepted and used as evidence of treason, was to risk everything. And yet, these women chose to risk it, believing that even a faint chance of rescue was worth the danger of being caught. Of course, rebellion came at a cost. Those who resisted openly often faced brutal punishments. Some were stripped of titles and locked away in remote castles. Others were declared insane, their reputations destroyed so that their cries for help could be dismissed as delusions. In the worst cases, they were poisoned or quietly executed, their deaths disguised as illness. Dynasties could not afford the scandal of open defiance, so they erased it with silence and lies. Yet every erased woman left behind a whisper of suspicion, a ghost that haunted the very system that tried to suppress her. Even within the walls of punishment, defiance endured. A princess locked in a tower might carve words into stone, etching her resistance into the walls meant to contain her. A queen accused of madness might use her supposed delirium to speak truths she would never have been allowed to voice otherwise. These moments of resistance, though easily overlooked, reveal an extraordinary resilience. They remind us that rebellion is not only about victory, but about refusing to be broken, even when defeat is certain. What makes these stories so powerful is not just the bravery of individual women, but the ripple effect they created. A single act of defiance could shake the confidence of entire courts. Rumors of a princess who refused her cousin spread quickly, sparking unease among subjects who wondered if their rulers truly commanded divine obedience. The illusion of harmony fractured each time a woman resisted, and those fractures grew wider with each generation. Dynasties depended on silence, but silence was never complete. And beyond the walls of the palace, society itself began to change. As ambassadors carried tales of defiance to foreign courts, questions rose about the wisdom of incestuous unions and forced marriages. When a princess fled to a convent or cried out in letters for mercy, she forced the world outside to confront what was happening inside. These acts of resistance were not always successful in saving the woman herself, but they planted doubt in the minds of others, and doubt is the first step toward change. The story of defiance, then, is not one of sweeping revolutions, but of fragile sparks. Each princess who resisted struck a match in the darkness, and though many of those matches were quickly extinguished, together they began to illuminate the truth. They showed that the crown was not unbreakable, that obedience was not eternal, and that even in the most controlled of lives, the human spirit still reached for freedom. But as rebellion spread in whispers and rumors, another shift began to take place, one not born from defiance alone, but from the undeniable collapse of the system itself. Dynasties could ignore letters and suppress voices, but they could not ignore the steady decay of their own power. The same marriages that were meant to preserve their rule were now destroying it, and the world was beginning to see the cracks that would eventually bring entire empires to their knees. The legacy of these forced unions did not remain locked inside the walls of palaces. Their echoes traveled far beyond the gilded chambers, leaving traces in dynasties, in politics, and in the collective imagination of the people. By the time centuries of incestuous marriages had produced fragile heirs and silenced generations of princesses, the cracks in the system were no longer deniable. What had once been presented as tradition, sanctity, and divine duty was slowly revealed as a cycle of destruction. And it was not only the women who paid the price, it was the kingdoms themselves. As heirs grew weaker, governments grew unstable. Wars of succession erupted when sickly princes died too young, or when questions of legitimacy poisoned the royal courts. Civil wars were not uncommon, sparked by whispers that an heir was too feeble to rule, or that a queen had secretly despised the union forced upon her. What had been justified as preservation of power became the very thing that threatened its survival. In Spain, the death of Charles II without an heir plunged Europe into the War of Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict that redrew the map of the continent. His body, twisted and frail from generations of inbreeding, became the physical symbol of a system collapsing under its own weight. The people themselves began to see through the illusion. Where once they had cheered the processions of royal weddings, they now whispered about curses and divine punishment. Superstition and gossip thrived in the gaps between the official narratives. A princess who failed to conceive was accused of sin. A king who could not produce a healthy heir was said to be bewitched. The myths of divine right, carefully cultivated by monarchs, began to unravel as subjects realized that power born of cruelty could not be blessed forever. The common folk may not have known the language of genetics, but they could see with their own eyes that something was deeply wrong. Even literature and art began to reflect the unease. Poets wrote veiled verses about captive birds in golden cages, metaphors for princesses trapped in silken prisons. Painters sometimes allowed hints of sorrow to creep into the faces of royal brides, subtle betrayals of the idealized portraits they were paid to create. Satirists mocked the deformities of heirs, turning them into symbols of the corruption of monarchy itself. Slowly, culture became a mirror of truth, reflecting what history books refused to write openly, that dynasties had destroyed themselves from within, all while pretending to shine. For the women themselves, the legacy was complicated. Many did not live long enough to see change. Their lives ended in silence, their names remembered only in genealogical charts and dynastic portraits. But in rare cases, stories of resistance survived, preserved in letters, confessions, or oral traditions. These fragments remind us that even when obedience seemed absolute, there were always sparks of rebellion, whispers of hope. They remind us that history is not only the story of kings and wars, but also of the women who bore the hidden cost of empire. In time, outside forces accelerated the collapse. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about individuality, freedom, and the role of women in society. The French Revolution shattered the illusion of divine monarchy altogether, showing that people would no longer tolerate rulers who treated them and their daughters as possessions. The old order began to crumble, and with it, the practice of marrying within the family lost its power. Dynasties had to adapt or perish, and many of them did both. What had once been the cornerstone of their stability was now remembered as the cause of their ruin. The haunting truth is that these marriages left behind scars that can still be traced today. Genetic studies reveal the extent of inbreeding among certain royal lines, confirming what whispers and rumors had long suggested. The Habsburg jaw, the fragile heirs, the infertile kings, they were not myths, but evidence carved into bone and blood. Even centuries later, their bodies testify to the price paid by women who had no choice but to obey. And yet, the most enduring legacy may not be genetic, but human. The silenced princesses, whose stories were hidden for so long, are slowly being rediscovered. Their letters are read in classrooms, their portraits reinterpreted by modern historians, their suffering acknowledged at last. They are no longer pawns in dynastic games, but voices in their own right, demanding that we remember the cost of crowns. Their pain, once erased, has become a lesson. That power built on silence and cruelty cannot endure forever. The tale of these princesses is therefore not just about the past. It is a warning for the present. It asks us to consider how often power still disguises abuse as tradition, how often appearances still mask suffering, how often voices are still silenced in the name of stability. The story is not merely historical, it is human, timeless, and unsettling. It challenges us to look beyond the glitter of authority and to ask what pain is hidden beneath. And as we step back from the gilded halls of Europe, from the palaces of Spain and France, from the temples of Egypt and beyond, we realize that this was never only the story of royalty. It is the story of control, of power exercised through the bodies of women, of silence demanded and endured. And it leads us to the final question, one that lingers long after the crowns have turned to dust. When the weight of tradition becomes indistinguishable from cruelty, what price are we truly willing to pay to preserve it?